Alright, so for the lecture material covered in week 1, we started going into the details about the origin of parent material, how parent material weathers, and how that looks in soils. Okay, so we talked about the 5 soil forming factors last week. Now, during this week, we covered more of the more specific information on each of the 5 soil forming factors, one of them being parent material. So in order for parent material to become soil, you need to break it down. So this is a weathering process. You have your parent material and it's becoming soil and all of the distinctive features of soil. So for this to happen, you need to weather away your bedrock or your parent material. There are 2 ways. One is physical weathering, which is a physical breakdown of the parent material. Any way that you can get this parent material to be smaller and smaller will lead to soil formation. So one example given in class was freeze-thaw action, where water can percolate into small cracks in your rock. It will freeze and it expands by 7% and pushes away the rock pieces and pretty much makes larger and larger cracks in your rock. And this physically weathers it so that you can break down your parent material to become soil. Another example about a physical weathering was, a tree growing its roots into rock, and that physically pushes the rock apart and that breaks it down. Another way of weathering is via chemical weathering. So that would be any reaction that pretty much reacts with this parent material and gives you a smaller version of the parent material. So one example given in class was a common reaction when water and carbon dioxide react to make carbonic acid, and that reacts with this bedrock, and that makes it into smaller pieces, and then that creates your soil. So there are 2, physical weathering and chemical weathering.
If you are confused by the additions, losses, transformations, and translocations in the soil, I recommend going into the textbook because it has a really good explanation of these processes.
So now that we've gotten a little bit of an idea of how parent material weathers, we also in soils are interested in how the parent material got there to form that soil. So we also like to characterize the origin of the parent material. So where did the parent material come from? So if it weathers in place, if there is bedrock and it was weathered in place and this became, say, a sea, this would be called residuum, where the bedrock is physically under the soil formed above it. So if it wasn't formed in place, you have other types of deposits of the parent material. Here are 2 examples. So they're called sediments. They came from somewhere else. So one is called alluvium and another is called colluvium. So alluvium is when the parent material was deposited through a river deposit. So with a river deposit, there is some sort of sorting that occurs when smaller particles are driven further down, where large particles like big rocks are dropped off fairly soon because it takes a lot of energy to take them further downriver. So you have a lot of sorting going on with different sizes of parent material. So huge rocks compared to smaller clay-like material going further down. So there is sorting with alluvium. The other type of deposit could be parent material deposited by gravity. So you can kind of think of when rocks fall down a cliff. That is an origin. That parent material wasn't formed in place, but it did come from up above and drops down. In this case, we don't see any type of sorting because gravity will just make all of the rocks fall downhill. So there's alluvium and colluvium. There's also other types. There's marine deposited. There are lacustrine deposits where it's lake sediments. You really want to go through each of these and really distinguish what gives you an idea of what the parent material's origin is.
Okay, so the difference between alluvium and lacustrine, they're both water sediments. Alluvium is a river deposit, whereas lacustrine is a lake. So the difference between a river and a lake is the water power behind it. A river tends to have a greater water power, so it can carry bigger items with it, whereas a lake is nice and calm and you'll have finer materials in it. Go.
So far in class we've covered one way of describing a soil profile. We are currently going over the morphologic profile. So that's the example we gave where you have an O, an A, an E, a B, a C, etc. So that's a morphologic horizon. But there's much more technical soil descriptions that you can use, which are called diagnostic horizons. So diagnostic horizons include epipetons, which are the surface horizons, and diagnostic subsurface horizons, the ones further below, underneath your surface horizon. So for epipetons, the two covered in class, you do need to know 4 of them, but here are just some examples of Moloch and Ochric. Moloch, you have darker surface horizons, where Ochric, you have much lighter surface horizons. So a diagnostic horizon description is much more inclusive than a morphologic description. Although something might be called a B in a diagnostic horizon, it might be considered something else. So this is just a more technical term, but morphologic does help us in the lab and out in the field of describing some soils.
So next we're going to go over the naming of the 12 soil orders. So here you have the 12 soil orders written out, and I have capitalized and underlined the formative element of each soil order. And the formative element, it just helps out when you're naming a soil series. So for example, if we look at alpha sol, the formative element is ALF. And then I'll see that formative element in an example of the name of a soil. And the formative element you find usually at the end of the name. So Durazeralf, I know it's an alpha sol because it has the formative ALF at the end.
Okay, so in class we covered soil color, and we also covered it in lab. And we have a distinct notation of soil color. So we describe the hue, the value, and the chroma. So typically we use a Munsell color book like we did in lab, but how do you distinguish the difference between hue, value, and chroma? So here's just a quick little example of how these differ. So say you were to have a paint bucket that had a base color like a white or tan or not really anything. Say you wanted a green color. You would add a dominant color to your paint bucket. This would be your hue. So your hue is any of your dominant colors. So in soil, say if you had a very yellow mineral coming in and making your soil yellow, or if you had like an iron oxide that made your soil red, those are dominant colors that you're adding to your paint bucket. And this is your hue. But say you were to add in black or white paint, changing the darkness or lightness. So if you added, say, black to your paint, you would get a much more darker looking green. But say you wanted to have a little bit more intense color, you would go ahead and add more of your dominant color, and this would be your chroma. So your chroma is just how intense that color is. So say initially you dropped in 2 drops of green. The chroma change would be just adding additional drops to make the color more intense. So lightness and darkness is your value, the dominant color you initially started with is your hue, and your intensity of the color is the chroma.
Hey, next week we're going out into the field on campus, so make sure to meet at our regular lab. Bring a hat because it's gonna be hot, and bring some water to drink, and bring some shoes and pants.
Alright, just a quick tip. Your lecture notes and your textbook are your primary resources. If you can't find the information that you need in these, come see us in office hours.